Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Wednesday evening's online seminar. Today we are joined by Richard Silver, Senior Partner at Silver Shemmings Ash, who's going to be talking about programming and time with both NEC and JCT. As always, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A panel at the bottom in your toolbar to submit these, and Richard will endeavour to answer as many as possible at the end of his presentation. If you have anything specific, please feel free to email him. As you can see, his contact details on the screen there, Richard Silver at silverllp.com. Anything else, Richard? No, I don't think so. Let's hand over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Good evening, all. As Julie said, my name is Richard Silver. Apart from being a lawyer, my background is in construction. I'm both a chartered surveyor and member of the Chartered Institute of Building. And I worked both as a construction director, chief surveyor, and junior roles during my construction career. It's one thing I state quite often is I was involved in many different construction projects, but unfortunately I'm unaware of any one of them finishing actually on time. Nearly all the projects I was involved in finished late. Obviously, it was not my fault. What we're going to deal with is programming under forms of contract and how you can use that program effectively for your benefit, or equally, if you are having the programs issued to you, what you should be looking out for. Before we go into the specifics of the NEC and JCT, I think it's important to give some general principles. I've been involved in no end of disputes, be it under the NEC, JCT or other forms. And what I've found both on the contractor side and on the employer side is general understandings are applied, notwithstanding what the form of contract is. General principles are applied as if they are the rules, and it's not always right. So I'm going to have to sort of go through these points and explain how the program is actually going to be used dependent upon the particular contract. Now, whilst there may be various reasons why a program is going to be produced, in my experience, as soon as there is an issue of late completion and the potential for liquidated and ascertained damages being applied, a party generally denies that they are responsible and will seek an extension of time. And in so doing, what they're going to need to do is to produce a program. They may use various ways of establishing what the delay is, but what they will use is a program showing that the original completion date should be extended for reasons for which they are not culpable. So that's one reason why a program is used. Next thing is that on a project where it is completed late, quite often the contractor will seek the recovery of loss and expense. And under most forms, in some way or another, delay to the project is linked to loss and expense, and particularly prolongation costs. So again, in seeking to recover that loss and expense, it is very likely that a contractor will produce a program. Final situation is whereby a party is seeking loss and expense against a subcontractor by way of example for general damages, and what they're going to be seeking to do is to show that that subcontractor was the critical delay. So there are three examples, all slightly different, as to why a party may need to produce a program identifying where delays have occurred. Now, under the JCT, just as a starting point, is the way that one assesses delay is completely different to that under the NEC. And I think it's imperative that this is understood. Under the JCT, your entitlement to extension of time should be based upon what is in effect the true position. So one starts with the date stated in the contract. And if you can show that date has been delayed for reasons for which entitles you to an extension of time, you will be successful. But you must show that the completion date has been delayed. Under the NEC, however, it is a completely different approach. It is nothing to do with what actually happened. And indeed, the contract may not even be delayed, but you are nevertheless entitled to an extension of time. And I've got the key clause here, 63.3, which says a delay to the completion date is assessed as the length of time that, due to the compensation event, planned completion is later than planned completion as shown on the accepted program. So we're not assessing an extension of time based upon the completion date stated in the contract, but to the contrary, the completion date as shown on the last accepted program. And we're also going to be doing it based upon forecast, what we anticipate the delay will be in the future. Whereas all of you will know under the JCT, generally the architect, the employer's agent, will have 12 weeks in which to consider any assessment, and they will do it retrospectively, generally. And indeed, most claims under the JCT are not considered till much, much later. Saying that, under the NEC, whilst it's meant to be done as part of compensation events, which we'll deal with a bit later, whilst they are forecast assessments, again, in my experience, most extensions of time as part of the assessment of compensation events are done after the event has actually occurred. But we'll come back to that a bit later. Now, I always say this, and I usually have 4 slides, or I ask people, what is a program for? And people come to me, a management tool, programming the works, monitoring progress. But as far as I'm concerned, it only has one purpose, and that is to advance or defend a claim. Now, when I'm in front of people, a lot of people look up at that and don't necessarily agree. And what I say to them is I've been in construction. I've done a number of construction projects over the years. And when I worked in construction, we had, on occasions, as many as 3 programs. We had one which we used internally to manage the works, and which generally we kept in a bottom drawer and didn't show the employer. We had one which we issued to the employer, which was a claim program. And we might have a third which we would issue to the subcontractors for them to undertake their works. But they were all very much different. Now, as I said, rather embarrassingly, I was involved in many, many projects and none of them finished on time. But it will come as no surprise. On each and every project I was involved, the delay wasn't my fault. It was somebody else's, and which, as far as I was concerned, always entitled me to an extension of time. Now, I get involved in many, many disputes now as an adjudicator. And in my experience, I've never seen a contractor say, we were 12 weeks behind and it's our fault. They will always, without exception, seek an extension of time. And indeed, in most cases I see, not only do they seek a full extension of time, they seek extensions of time beyond the actual period of delay. And I think we need to recognise that. Most contractors, when faced with liquidated damages, quite rightly seek an extension of time. And if they are going to seek an extension of time, be it under the NEC or the JCT, one of the primary documents that will enable their claim to stand or fall will be their program. And what I can tell you is that I have defeated parties' claims based upon their own program. Their program has been produced so poorly, it has actually either undermined their claim or supported ours, because those that have produced it haven't given it due consideration. So the starting point when dealing with programming and planning is to establish what the obligations are with regards to programs. And sometimes what we get issued with at day one is what is called a contract program. When I worked in construction, we always had what we termed as a construction program, a contract program. And, I was told on the first day I was on site, what you do is you keep that contract program, you never amend it, whatever the outcome, and always record against that. And I'm going to tell you, as a starting point, that's wrong. And we're going to identify why in a moment. But The main point is it wasn't a contract program anyway. So the question is, what is a contract program? Really simple. A contract program is a contract document. It is a document that is incorporated into the contract, and hence the term contract program. If it is not in the contract, it is not a contract document, it is not a contract program. And under the JCT, we don't have reference in the JCT to contract program, we have master program. It is not a contract document. So if that's right, what's the implications if there is a contract program? Well, the answer is it has contractual obligations. It is part of the obligations that are imposed upon the contractor or the employer as set out in that contract document, depending upon what the contract clauses say, priority of documents and the like. But what in theory a contract program does is it places obligations upon a contractor to comply with it, but equally upon an employer to allow the contractor to carry out the works in accordance with it. However, quite often the contract program is at odds with the other provisions of the contract. And as a consequence, it is often the case that the contract program, despite being a contract document, has no force because it is inconsistent with what the contract provides elsewhere. And indeed, under the JCT, by way of example, it says that it takes priority over any other contract document. Now, if you look at the JCT, it says you shall start on such a date and you shall complete by such and such a date. And if you fail to do so, liquidated damages may be applied. That's at odds with a contract program included, which shows loads of start dates and loads of completion dates for different activities. The two are inconsistent. And as a consequence, there is a distinct possibility that the contract program cannot be relied upon. So if you're going to include a contract program, make sure it is consistent with the other provisions within the contract. The next thing is what should you include on a program? And there is a big difference between those of you who have worked on engineering projects and those that work on building projects. On engineering projects, they will have a critical path analysis. They will have floats. They will have loads of bars. They will have numerous links. Too often on a construction program, you just have some bars. So what's the right approach? Well, the answer is if you have a very detailed program with loads of links and it's all properly programmed and detailed, then it will work and help you in establishing delay. But equally, it will help the employer in establishing delay because it's going to show what's actually going on. So if you're very efficient and you're doing your job properly and you're delayed by others, it may be much easier to substantiate that. But equally, if a job isn't going so well, it will quite clearly show that you're not performing. Now, I often ask, when is a program out of date? Well, the answer is the date's issued. I've never been able to properly follow a program. There are always no end of reasons, from failed logic, factors outside of my control, non-performance of subcontractors, the list goes on. So quite often the program will not be able to be followed. And therefore, if you're issuing it as a contractor, you need to provide yourself with some flexibility. You want a program that ideally will substantiate an entitlement to extension of time when you need it, but equally cannot be used against you to show that you are behind program. So how are you going to do that? Well, what I would suggest, and to some degree even under the NEC, which we're going to address a little later on, I would generally show on my program the earliest possible start dates for all activities. That way, number one, it's going to require the employer to give me access to achieve those start dates. It would also require me to have all such sufficient information to be able to start those activities. And if for any reason I'm prevented from starting according to the dates that I've put on my program, I can claim an extension of time. But the problem is, quite often I experience that, maybe progress on site isn't going so well because of my failures. And on that basis, I might put the latest finish dates for all activities. So whatever happens, I cannot be blamed for finishing an activity late for reasons that I cannot claim an extension of time. But then how can you deal with that earliest start dates and latest finish dates? Well, the reason is that what we should have to give us the best position is those program bars overlapping each other. And let's be honest, that is reflective of what happens on site. No one does all the foundations before they do the slabs. They pull some of the foundations and then pull some of the slabs and parts of the slabs and parts of the beams. You don't plaster the whole building before you start painting. You plaster one room, you then move to the next, and as the first room is available, you might then start painting. So activities will overlap. So I would suggest, and obviously don't take it to the extreme, you identify your activities starting as early as possible and finishing late as possible. The next issue is provisional sums. Now, provisional sums are provisional. I'm not necessarily going to have to undertake them. I'll undertake them if they're expended and I'm given instructions, but I don't have to necessarily undertake them. So do I include provisional sums on my program? I only do so if the contract requires me to. If it doesn't, I don't include them. The next thing is, where do I want to show the provisional sums? I want to show them at the earliest point in my program, so that if I don't get instructions in due time, it's a delay event entitling me to an extension of time. And what's more, it is a delay for lack of instruction and not in relation to the provisional sum. The final thing I might well do is on the provisional sums is to show the shortest possible period for them, so that when I actually get the instruction and it looks like those works will be far more complicated and require more time, I again will seek to claim. Finally, and extremely important, particularly under NEC contracts and engineering contracts, where there is different access dates, I'm going to show the need to get access as early as possible to areas, so that where access is not provided, I can claim an extension of time. So these are basic principles which will entitle a party to claim more extension of time than maybe they would have been able to do so had they not shown these requirements. Equally, if I'm an employer, I'm going to be mindful of this, and I may indeed amend the contract so that they can't use these tricks. Now, the NEC, as we're going to deal with later, has loads and loads of clauses on what programming and planning is required and what information is required. But if one goes to the JCT, it simply says the contractor shall issue a master program. There's nothing in it in the standard form as to what information needs to be on it and how often it's going to be updated. I think that's woefully inadequate. So one thing I am often asked to do is to draft and amend the JCT to include provisions for programming and planning. As I mentioned, when should you revise a program? I get no end of answers on that, but very simply, there are two circumstances where if you're going to maximize your entitlement, you should issue a revised program. And the first one is where you are in front of program. If I am 1 week in front of program and I'm delayed by a week for an event which would entitle me an extension of time, the other party is likely to say you have no entitlement because you were in front of program by a week. All we've done is to catch up or lost that float. You were 1 week in front, you're now on time, no extension of time. So where I am in front of program, I will generally issue a revised program showing I'm back on program. So when's the other way I should revise a program? The other one is where I am in behind program for my own fault. So I'm on a project and I am showing myself 1 week behind, and then an event occurs which would entitle me to an extension of time of 1 week. What's the other party going to argue? Well, your event is a concurrent event or is the dominant or critical event, so you're entitled to nothing. So if you show yourself where you're behind program, back on program, then if that event occurs, you're entitled to extension of time. Now, I did refer to the NEC a moment ago and about it's the last accepted program, but every argument I've had with project managers, they use the same viewpoints. If you're 1 week behind and then there is a further delay of a week, no entitlement extension time. You're 1 week in front of program, because of an event you're 1 week behind, no entitlement to an extension of time. So that's why I think those recommendations I put forward work under all forms of contract, be it the NEC, JCT or otherwise. Now, we're going to look in a bit more detail at the NEC first. And the first thing of those who haven't dealt with the NEC is this clause. And the contract provides that there is ideally a first accepted program, and that is going to be produced in the contract, or is going to be produced generally and included in the contract data. I would strongly suggest, if you are the employer, to ensure that there is at least a first accepted program. It should be one of the things that you want from the contractor prior to actually placing the contract with them. Because at that stage, they're going to be reasonable and work with you. And they're going to provide the information that is necessary to form that accepted program. I often find too often on projects I get involved in, I ask, where are the accepted programs? And the response is, well, we don't have any. The contractor's issued 50 programs, but we've rejected every one of them because they're not right. And then we wonder why we've got a dispute. So as a starting point, I would strongly suggest that an employer should seek to ensure that there is at the beginning an accepted program. But the way the NEC works is that any new accepted or any new program which is accepted displaces the previous one. It becomes the new accepted program. And what we're looking at is a number of accepted programs throughout the project duration, each one superseding the last. What we can therefore see is this accepted program is a developing document. It is meant to enable us to construct the works by greater management. But what I would say to you is if you are on the NEC and you are going to fully comply with its provisions on, let's say, a major project, you better have a team of planners. And equally, if you're going to act as a project manager, make sure you have full support to back you up in reviewing hundreds, if not thousands of programs. It is my experience, and I've had this argument with many, many people, is on very, very few projects are there the right amount of accepted programs issued and approved required by the contract. More often than not, as the project progresses, less and less programs are issued and even less are accepted. But as far as this contract is concerned, we're anticipating lots of accepted programs, each one displacing the last. Recognizing the importance of having a program, we have clause 31.1, which entitles the project manager, in effect, to withhold monies otherwise due to the contractor if there is not the first accepted program issued. And as you can see at 50.5, the employer can retain 25% of monies that would otherwise fall due until this first program is issued. Now, I have often amended this contract and not just had it applicable to the first program, but as to all programs that are required under the contract. We did reduce it from 1 quarter, but I think it's imperative under this form of contract that there are programs issued in the format that is required. Which turns us to what is actually on this program. Now, I'm not going to read all these things through, but do quickly, whilst I'm talking to you, read these. And what you will see is we are not really talking about a program. We're talking about a program, method statements, health and safety and risk assessments, labour histograms, method statements, the list goes on. We are looking to provide a lot of information, and this program is meant to be regularly updated, and hence all the other documents that are associated with the program. So it is a major exercise. And what I find quite often is the case is the contractor doesn't fully understand what these obligations impose upon them. And thereby, when they try to issue programs for acceptance, quite often those programs do not comply. And as a consequence, the programs are not accepted. In that the programs are not accepted, the contractor gets frustrated and then chooses not to issue any further programs. And then we have a complete absence of what went on. So my advice to both parties is the contractor, if even you do not get an accepted program or program accepted, do not stop issuing them. Keep issuing them, because they may well be the only record that you will have as to what went on. Equally, if you're a project manager and you do not agree with the contractor's program, it is not sufficient for you to simply reject it, but is to actually explain why you reject it and to keep an adequate record of what is the true position. And I would suggest to both parties, think about one thing that will really support and prove that your program was right. And the answer is photographs. I would be looking to keep a whole load of photographs showing the photos taken at the date that the program was issued in support. Or if you're the employer, to show that the program is in fact not correct. What we then have is the update of that program. And what we've got to do is provide lots of information. So at the beginning and the end, we have to include on the program access, float, and all this other information. And we need to include this information on each and every program we issue for acceptance. There is a hell of a lot of information that is required. And if you produce it and you keep it, it will very much support your position. And as I'm going to identify a little later on, it is this information that will be the very foundation of your claim for a compensation event. And hence, if you do not include this information, you are at substantial risk that you will not be able to claim certain compensation events. We've got more details here with regards to revisions to program. Now, just to clarify, under the NEC, unlike, for example, the JCT, we have compensation events. And those compensation events encompass any instructions which is deemed a variation, using the terminology under the JCT. And as part of the compensation event, we consider not only the variation, but also the associated loss and expense and an extension of time. For other matters that are not variations, let's just give an example, weather, where there is exceptionally adverse weather conditions, that is a compensation event, and we assess the extension of time and loss and expense together in an assessment of that compensation event. So, in other words, when we're dealing with any event which causes delay, loss and expense, or a change to the value of the works to be undertaken, such assessment is rolled up. And each and every compensation event must be dealt with separately. Now, under JCT, it is not uncommon to have what is often referred to as a rolled up or global claims. We claim all the variations. We refer to no end of other events like late information and instructions. And then we say, and all of these events caused us 60 weeks worth of delay. There's so many delays, we cannot break down which event caused which period. But here is this global claim, and we want 50 weeks. And by the way, we also want £600 million in loss and expense. Now, there are cases that say you can have global claims in certain circumstances under the JCT, but what is clear is under the NEC, you can't. Under the NEC, you assess each and every compensation event separately, and as part of that assessment, you consider what entitlement to extension of time the contractor is entitled and what entitlement to loss and expense. And if you can't substantiate that, then you don't have any other entitlement. Clearly, in assessing this compensation, what we've got to look at is the program. We've got here about revisions of program, and basically under the contract we have generally a statement that says that the contractor shall produce a program at the period stated in the contract data, which is often monthly. So under the contract, the contractor is meant to submit a revised program for acceptance every month. He is then also entitled to issue a program when he chooses to, and whenever requested by the project manager. And as we've already identified, in each case when dealing with an assessment of a compensation event. And in regards to each compensation event, there should be a program. Not one program against 20 compensation events, but one program to one CE. How many compensation events do you averagely get on a project? There are loads of them. And hence, in theory, there should be loads of programs. And indeed, if I get an instruction today and another one tomorrow, then I should be issuing 2 programs. If I get 5 instructions today, I, in theory, should be issuing 5 programs for each and every compensation event. And you can see how very easily the amount of programs can be huge. As I identified, when dealing with compensation events, we have an obligation to issue quotations. And where we are saying that that compensation event is causing a delay, we should issue a program. And we look at the program issued with the quotation compared with the last program, and the difference is what our entitlement is. And it should be remembered that this program is based upon projection, forecast, what happens in the future. It is not retrospectively looked at. And indeed, in certain circumstances where quotations are issued late and notices, a contractor can lose their entitlement. Once the contractor submits their quotation, the project manager is obliged to consider that quotation and respond within 2 weeks, either accepting the quotation, asking the contractor to submit a revised quotation, or saying he will be doing it himself. And where the project manager is going to do that himself, do be aware, I would strongly suggest that that should include a program identifying what the time entitlement is, even if it is nil. Where the project manager fails to respond to a program, the contractor can advise him of that failure. And if he fails to respond to the quotation, it can be deemed he's accepted it. But where rejecting the program, the project manager has to give reasons. And it's not because I don't like it. It's got to be one of the bullet points. And there they are in the middle of the page. It's not practicable. The program as you produced is just unrealistic and doesn't reflect what's going on in the works. It does not show the information which this contract requires. And we've identified the huge amount of information that should be contained on a program. It does not represent the contractor's plans realistically, or it does not comply with the scope. These are the reasons upon which the PM can reject the program. So, in summary to this, recognise that under the NEC, the program is a vitally important document. It is the very basis of one's entitlement. And when assessing what is the entitlement to extension of time, one must look at the accepted program. Problems arise where there are no accepted programs, or indeed no programs are being issued. And it is not meant to be a retrospective delay analysis. It should be based upon what is the forecast delay. And as far as project managers are concerned, if all we've got on the table is 600 programs issued by the contractor, all been rejected, but no other information, you're going to have a difficulty in defending your position. Now, what I've done is I've just pointed out some of the compensation events here that are provided under the NEC. And these actually refer to the program. It says that the client does not allow access as shown on the accepted program. You don't have an accepted program and you don't have details of access, you don't have that event. You can't rely upon it because you can't prove it. 60.13, the client does not provide something that he is down to provide as shown on the accepted program. No accepted program, then he didn't have to provide it. So it is vitally important that you include all the information that is required under the contract to enable you to actually claim for compensation events under this form. This is an important one, 60.119, an event which stops the contractor completing the whole of the works or stops the completing the whole of the works by the date for planned completion shown on the accepted program, and which neither party could prevent, and an experienced contractor would judge at the contract date of having a small chance of occurring. But recognise again, it is cross-reference to the accepted program. No accepted program, you're going to have difficulty claiming under this compensation event. Now going to turn to the JCT. Under the date JCT, we have dates of possession, and then we have a completion date or sectional completion dates. I've had a number of matters before me in recent months, all to do with phasing, where there is either one completion date or sectional completion dates, but over and above that requirement, they've allowed or sought to provide for phasing. And there is even a phasing program and a phasing schedule. And it's really simple. Don't do it because it will possibly fail. You have an inconsistency. You have a date for possession of the section and you have a date of completion for the section, and the contract doesn't provide for any phasing. So you have an inconsistency. And it is every possibility that that phasing requirement will fail. So if you want phasing, one of two things: either make each and every phase a section, or secondly, amend the contract. Because under the JCT, it won't work, and equally under the NEC, it won't work. Got the case there. A contractor is entitled to plan and carry out the works to suit itself unless provision to the contrary. Well, under the JCT, there isn't. There's a start date and there's a completion date. Oh, yes, you've got this phasing, but that's inconsistent with the contract, and the contract says it takes priority. So on that basis, the contractor can carry out the works in any sequence they like. I should point out here that quite often contractors, when appointing subcontractors, fail to consider this entitlement. So if you want to have control against your M&E subcontractor and you want them to do house 1, then house 2 or house 3, or all the first fix, then followed by the second fix, followed by the third fix, following by commissioning, etc., then your contract has to set that requirement down, because if it doesn't, they can do it in any sequence they like. Now, under the JCT, we have a very different situation to what we had under the NEC. And indeed, this sort of situation arose on a project when I was a quantity surveyor. On this particular project, the situation was that our estimating department, in their brilliance, had been asked to tender for works where the contract duration was stated to be 60 weeks. They looked at the scope of works and said, well, we really want to win this job. So what we will do is we'll price it on the basis of 50 weeks. So our preliminary allowance was 50 weeks, despite the contract period being 60 weeks. When we were secured the project, we produced a program for 50 weeks, despite the contract we having signed up being for 60 weeks. We asked for all the information to be issued to enable us to complete in 50 weeks, but we couldn't because the architect didn't issue information on time, and we ultimately finished in 60 weeks. We sought an extension of time for 10 weeks and got nothing, because under the JCT, a party cannot unilaterally seek to impose upon the other an obligation to provide information earlier than is required to complete by the completion date. The obligation in regards to the provision of information is to provide information to enable the contractor to complete by the completion date, or where they're behind program, to meet with the progress of the works. So under the JCT, the contractor, whilst having a right to complete early, has no contractual right to enforce the employer and their team to provide information to enable them to complete early. So the situation is completely different to the NEC. Under the NEC, entitlements extension of time are based upon the difference between the last accepted programme and the current. And the last accepted programme could show a date that is earlier than that is provided in the contract, because there is no bullet point rejecting a programme on the basis that it shows an earlier date than that stated in the contract data. You would have to put in a Z clause to cover that, or in the works information. Under the NEC, we have just here a quick thing on the coronavirus. As you would expect, this is a common issue being raised, and we've just referred to this case for your general information. So, in summary, the situation is very simple. As to between the two parties, a programme is in place for one reason. It's a claim. Indeed, under the NEC, it is clearly a claim because in assessing the compensation events, the method of doing it is looking at the last accepted programme against the current accepted programme. And what I'm advising you is depending on how you produce those programs, may have a major impact upon your entitlement. If you follow certain rules, you can actually get more entitlement. Equally, if you're an employer, be it under the JCT or the NEC, ensure that you are controlling what programs are issued and when and how and with what information. And therefore, I would strongly suggest to you, you ought to be amending the standard provisions. So under the NEC, I would be looking to put in a Z clause with additional provisions with programming. Under the JCT, I will be incorporating lots of provisions with regards to programming, reflecting what is already in place under the NEC. Now, I hope that's of help to you. I've obviously covered a lot of ground in what is a fairly short period of time. But Julie, are there any questions?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, Richard. How can you amend the access date agreed with the contractor under an NEC contract if that access date is not possible because, for example, the land in question has not yet been acquired from the third party? So, for example, the legals relating to the acquisition have been delayed.
Depends upon which contract. Under the NEC, it will be a compensation event. That's the only way. So the contractor's got a date for access that is either not provided for in the contract data at all, or matches what's stated in the contract data. It's not been able to be provided. That constitutes a compensation event and is to be assessed. Under the JCT, the failure to give access will be a relevant event. It may, however, possibly even make time at large, because under the JCT, we have a lack of access as a relevant event, but it is limited in certain circumstances to just 6 weeks. So where you delay it for 7 weeks, you've exceeded what the contract provides and may well render time at large. And as a consequence, damages at large.
Okay. Can a client accept or not accept longer programs and associated costs in relation to COVID measures?
Okay. Again, will depend upon the contract. Under the JCT, it's likely to be a force majeure action. So I think it is unlikely that the contractor will be entitled to any more money. Under the NEC, it could be, including 19, and as a result, being a compensation event, it would be entitled to potentially time and money. But as a strict answer to the question, the parties can agree what they like. So an employer can quite easily do that if they choose. And indeed, I know many employers who have done that approach. But under the contract, it will depend upon what those terms are. Under the JCT, it's likely, or it may entitle an extension of time, but no loss in expense. Under the NEC, it is a possibility of entitling time and money. But equally, under certain circumstances, it may be the contractor is entitled to nothing, depending upon when the contract was put in place.
Okay. How do you assess events which move activities and not planned completion? For example, gang times are extended without impact to the overall planned completion.
Well, then that's simply a compensation event where there is additional money, which is to be assessed, included, to follow the contract. If there is the schedule of cost components, you value it, but ultimately there's no delay to completion, and therefore there's no extension of time. But you may have prolongation costs. For example, we were doing external rendering, which is not on the critical path, but by reason of late information and additional instructions, we've got to keep the scaffolding on site for an extra 10 weeks than we planned for, and we're going to have to have an external foreman longer than we planned for, so we can claim all that money, notwithstanding that the delay to the completion isn't affected.
Okay. And is there an explanation that can be given as to how force majeure does not entitle cost or time?
No, there isn't an explanation, because it would depend upon the contract. Certain contracts provide for recovery and certain don't. The simple situation is that when you enter into a contract, the contract does not have to give the contractor entitlement if it is an event for which the employer is not responsible. So let's give you an example. If I say you must complete works within a week, and I don't have any event for weather, and there is terrible weather, nothing we've ever seen before, that's your risk, contractor. It's not my fault. And if you've priced it, hard luck. So it equally applies to the coronavirus. I do not have to give, if the contract doesn't provide for any extension of time, hard luck, contractor, you've priced that risk because I've not caused it. Where I've caused it, there needs to be a relevant event, because if there is not, and I can't award an extension of time, time and damages are rendered at large.
Okay. I think that is all the questions done, unless anyone has any others. There doesn't seem to be, so that's good. Thank you very much for your time, Richard. Thank you everyone for attending. As always, as Richard mentioned, as I've mentioned, if you wish to contact him directly, it's Richard Silver at silverllp.com. Thank you all for turning up, and we will hopefully see you again next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
No problem.